The first crack in the night's perfection came when the Duke of Ravenscar shattered his engagement beneath the golden chandeliers, but the true shock was that he spoke my name as the ballroom gasped. I did not even realize I had frozen in place until the sound of it, Lady Emilia, rolled across the marbled floor, carried on a hush of disbelief so sharp it felt like a blade drawn from its sheath. One moment, all of London's nobility was admiring the radiant Lady Clarissa Hale, my elder sister, glowing at the center of the Harrington Grand Ball as the woman destined to become a duchess. The next, her betrothed, His Grace Adrian Ravenscar, stood before her with a face carved from storm clouds and steel, announcing with chilling clarity that their engagement was at an end. The orchestra faltered mid-waltz, bowstrings stuttering into silence, fans snapped shut, a jeweled hairpiece clattered somewhere across the floor. Every glittering eye turned toward the couple who had long been the talk of society, the perfect match that now lay shattered at Clarissa's satin slippers. She stared at him with stunned outrage, searching for an argument that would restore her power, but Adrian did not yield. His voice, low and resolute, carried the certainty of a man who had chosen truth over pretense, even at the cost of scandal. I stood half, hidden behind a marble column, exactly where people expected to find me, somewhere on the edge, barely noticed, always overshadowed, the invisible Hale sister, the quiet one, the one who blended into wallpaper while Clarissa dazzled like cut diamond. And yet, as the air thickened with whispers and Clarissa's outrage sharpened into something close to accusation, Adrian's gaze lifted above the murmuring crowd and stopped, absolutely, unmistakably, on me. It felt impossible. His eyes were dark, unreadable, but there was something there, something like recognition or understanding or perhaps even apology for a wrong I did not know I had suffered. His attention burned through the layers of insignificance I had worn for years. A path of silence opened between us as if the room itself held its breath. My heart slammed against my ribs, my pulse deafening. Why was he looking at me? What had I done? Why invoke my name now, in the midst of the greatest scandal the Ton had witnessed all winter? Clarissa followed his gaze and saw me, and in that instant, something twisted and furious flashed across her expression, as if my very existence were an additional betrayal. I wanted to vanish. I wanted to evaporate into candle smoke. But it was far too late. Everyone saw it. Everyone saw me. And the moment Adrian Ravenscar spoke my name aloud in that vaulted ballroom, the world I had spent years slipping quietly through cracked apart, and the path that had always belonged to my sister suddenly, and terrifyingly, shifted toward me. I fled before I realized my feet were moving, slipping through the crush of stunned faces and whispering clusters, until the musicless hush of the ballroom fell away behind me, and the cool night air of the conservatory wrapped around my shaking breath. Glass walls rose above me like a cathedral of frost, moonlight dripping through the panes and casting silver shadows over the winter orchids and pale-leaved vines. I gripped the nearest marble railing, as if it could steady the tremor running through my body, but nothing could fully quiet the roar in my ears, the echo of Adrian Ravenscar's voice speaking my name as though it belonged in that room, as though I belonged in that room. I had never hated attention more. I had grown accustomed to invisibility, even comfortable in it. It had kept me safe from comparison, from expectation, from scrutiny. But tonight, invisibility had been stolen from me in one breath. I forced myself to steady my breathing, but humiliation burned hot behind my eyes. They all saw. They all think I had something to do with it. The glass doors behind me clicked softly, and panic clutched my chest. I did not want another spectator, least of all one who might assume I had somehow engineered this disaster. I turned sharply, bracing for Clarissa's fury or our mother's scolding or some breathless debutante eager to pry the truth from me. Instead, I found Adrian Ravenscar standing framed in the doorway, moonlight turning the edges of his dark hair silver, his expression unreadable yet undeniably focused on me. "Lady Emilia," he said quietly, his voice stripped of the authority it had carried in the ballroom. "Forgive me. I should not have followed, but I feared you might think that I played a part." The words escaped before I could swallow them. They hung in the air, trembling with the weight of my fear. His brows drew together in something like pain. "No," he answered, stepping closer though leaving space between us, as if he sensed how fragile I felt. "I feared you might think I wished for your attention, or worse, that I meant to drag you into the scandal I caused." I shook my head, unable to hold his gaze. "You did not drag me. The moment you spoke my name, they all decided what they wanted to believe." He exhaled, slow and tight, as though he carried the heaviness of a man who had broken something far beyond a betrothal. "I never intended to involve you," he said, "but when I saw you, standing alone while the room turned cruel around your sister, I realized I had already done enough damage for one night. And yet I made it worse." The honesty in his voice startled me. No man of his rank owed me an apology. No man of his rank ever even noticed me. I dared to lift my eyes to his, finding not arrogance but a quiet intensity, as though he searched for something he could not articulate. "I am sorry," he said again. "Truly." Before I could respond, distant footsteps echoed through the ballroom beyond, and the spell between us fractured. I stepped back instinctively, and he froze as though afraid to alarm me further. The moment dissolved into the cold air, leaving only the ache of something unspoken, something fragile, something neither of us understood, but neither of us could deny. By morning, London had devoured the scandal whole and spit it back out as twisted truth. I knew it the moment I descended the Hale staircase and saw my mother clutching the latest society papers with trembling fingers, her lips pressed into a thin, furious line as though she could physically hold her disappointment inside her mouth. "You must not go out today," she said without greeting, without affection, without even her usual practiced gentility. "Not a single step. Not after this." I did not need to ask what this was. The paper lay open on the table, its ink still smelling faintly of oil and cold metal from the press. The sketch at its center struck me like a physical blow. My likeness, exaggerated, pathetic, peering out from behind Clarissa like a shadow with greedy hands, reaching for the Duke of Ravenscar as if grasping at something forbidden. Beneath it, the headline screamed, "The unseen sister who stole a duke's gaze." My stomach lurched. "Mother," I whispered, horrified. "That is not. They say you lured him," she snapped, crushing the paper in one elegant fist. "They say you plotted to ruin Clarissa's match so you could rise in her place. They say you orchestrated the entire humiliation." Her voice trembled, and that, more than her anger, made fear curl coldly through me. "I did nothing," I said, quieter than I meant to. My mother closed her eyes, as if the truth were an inconvenience she did not have time to confront. "The truth does not matter," she said, "only what they believe." The words struck deeper than any accusation. Only what they believe, only what they choose to see. Only the version of Emilia Hale that fit their narrative, the dull sister desperate for scraps of attention. I slipped away before my mother could continue, though her silence was somehow louder than her scolding. In the corridor, the servants avoided my eyes. Even the footman who had opened doors for me since childhood looked at me as though I carried a stain. I retreated to the drawing room, where the winter light filtered in as a pale wash across the carpet. But tranquility did not last. Clarissa swept into the room like a storm cloud still crackling with the lightning of last night's ruin. She looked stunning even with fury reddening her eyes, golden hair flawless, gown impeccable, expression sharpened to a blade. "Are you pleased?" she asked softly, dangerously. "Have you enjoyed your triumph?" "Clarissa, stop," I whispered, horrified she would think I sought any of this. "I never—" "He looked at you," she hissed. "Do you understand what that will do to my reputation? Do you understand how this will follow me for years?" Pain stung behind my eyes, but I held her gaze. "I did nothing," I repeated. "You know that." She laughed, a brittle, breaking thing. "What I know," she said coldly, "is that society will destroy you for what happened, and I will not lift a finger to save you." Then she left, leaving the echo of her words and the crumpled caricature still staining the table. And it was in that hollow, frozen moment that I understood. This scandal was no longer a story about Adrian and Clarissa. It had become a story about me, whether I wished it or not. 3 days passed before I saw Adrian Ravenscar again, and I had begun to hope, foolishly, that perhaps the scandal would fade if I simply remained silent and invisible. But on the 4th morning, as I sat in the parlor attempting to distract myself with embroidery, I could barely see through my anxious haze. A commotion stirred in the foyer. Low masculine voices, my mother's hasty murmurs, Clarissa's sharp inhale of shock, it all blended into a hum that made my pulse throb unevenly. Before I could rise, the parlor door opened, and there he stood, the Duke of Ravenscar, tall and composed, dressed in a winter coat that still carried the crisp scent of frost, and he was holding something small in his gloved hand. Clarissa reached him first, emerging from the hallway with a smile so sweet it could curdle milk. "Your Grace," she purred, dipping into a graceful curtsy. What an unexpected honor. It was a performance, perfectly executed, but Adrian did not acknowledge it. His gaze passed over her as though she were nothing more than a passing draught of air, settling instead upon me with quiet certainty. Clarissa's smile faltered. "Lady Emilia," he said, stepping into the room. Only then did I see the object he carried. My glove, pale silk embroidered with tiny leaves, the one I had dropped in my frantic escape the night of the ball. "I believe this belongs to you." My breath caught. "You? Came all this way to return it?" "I came," he said, "because it was yours." The words were simple, but something in the way he spoke them, steady, deliberate, without courtly flourish, sent a flutter down my spine. Clarissa moved between us, slipping her arm through his, as though reclaiming her place. "How thoughtful of your grace," she said with brittle brightness. But truly, there was no need. We could have sent a footman. Adrian's arm stiffened beneath her touch. He did not pull away, yet the tension radiating from him made the air hum. "I wish to ensure Lady Emilia received it safely," he replied, tone courteous but cool. "Personally." Clarissa blinked as if struck. "Well," she said tightly, "I suppose it is fortunate you arrived, though I must warn you, we are terribly occupied. News, invitations, social demands, one hardly has time to breathe." Her voice sharpened as she added, "particularly with the latest rumors being so inconvenient." The implication hung between us like smoke. Adrian's jaw tightened. "Rumors," he repeated, "are rarely aligned with truth." His eyes flicked to me again, softening. "And truth is what concerns me." Clarissa's composure cracked. "Truth?" she echoed. "How charming." But I saw the fear flash behind her anger. She realized, with dawning horror, that her hold over him had dissolved completely, and that I, invisible Emilia, stood somewhere he could actually see. "Your Grace," I said quietly, stepping forward, unable to bear the tension any longer. "Thank you for returning my glove. Truly. But you must not trouble yourself further. You owe me nothing." Adrian inclined his head, but the look in his eyes suggested he disagreed. "Sincerely. Deeply. Dangerously. On the contrary," he murmured, "I owe you far more than you know." Clarissa stiffened as though struck across the face, and in that fragile, breathless moment, I understood that this visit had not been a simple courtesy. It had been a choice, one that shifted the balance of our world in a way none of us could yet name. The garden walk was never meant to be intimate. It was meant to be a display, a carefully arranged gesture orchestrated by my mother to prove to the watching world, and to Clarissa's remaining allies, that the Hale family was unbroken, despite the scandal tearing at our edges. But there was no mistaking the tension that rippled beneath the frozen hedges. As Adrian Ravenscar offered me his arm before half the guests gathered on the terrace, their eyes glittering with poorly concealed curiosity. I hesitated only a heartbeat before placing my hand lightly upon his sleeve, aware that every movement, every breath, every glance was being dissected. The cold air bit at my cheeks as we stepped into the frosted garden, but the space away from prying ears felt like the first full breath I had taken in days. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Our footsteps crunched over the gravel path. The faint winter sunlight spilling across dormant rose bushes and barren branches adorned with delicate frost. My heart hammered with the weight of unspoken questions, but it was Adrian who broke the silence first. "I owe you more explanation than I gave you that night," he said quietly, his voice stripped of the authority it usually carried. "You have been forced into a storm not of your making, and I will not pretend I played no part in it." I looked up at him, uncertain. "You owe me nothing, Your Grace." "I disagree," he murmured, stopping beneath an archway woven with skeletal vines. "The truth behind the broken engagement is not what society believes. Clarissa was not the victim she pretends to be." His pause lingered like a bruise. "There was another man, one she met in secret for months, one she swore to me did not exist until I saw the evidence myself." I felt the breath leave my body, not out of triumph, not out of vindication, but out of a deep, hollow sadness for a sister I had loved, despite her many cruelties. "I am sorry," I whispered. "I never wished her hurt." "That," he said, studying me with something like wonder, "is precisely what sets you apart." Embarrassment warmed my face. "I am not a saint, Your Grace. I understand what it is to want something you fear you can never have." His gaze softened, the icy edges of it melting into something that unsettled me more than his intensity ever had. "And what is it you fear you can never have?" "A place where I might fully belong," I admitted, hardly louder than the whisper of wind through the branches. The confession surprised us both. He stepped closer, just enough for his presence to warm the chilled air between us. "Then those who fail to see your worth," he said, "have been blind indeed." I looked away, heart trembling. "Words like those," I murmured, "could destroy me if spoken lightly." "I do not speak lightly," he replied, voice low and earnest, and though the garden was cold, a thread of something warm and terrifying wound itself through the stillness. An unspoken shift neither of us dared to name as we walked back toward the terrace where dozens of curious eyes waited, unaware that something fragile and irrevocable had just taken root between us. The days that followed our garden walk unfolded like a tightening noose, each hour bringing new whispers, new sideways glances, new clipped conversations that ceased the moment I entered a room. It began subtly, with a missing invitation here, a postponed tea there, explanations offered in tones too sweet to be sincere. But by the end of the week, the shift was unmistakable. London had chosen its villain, and I, quiet, forgettable Emilia Hale, had become the most convenient culprit. Clarissa's work, I soon learned, was both thorough and vicious. She had always possessed a talent for influence, cultivated over years of being adored, admired, and sought after by every hostess with aspirations of power. Now she wielded that influence like a blade. Lady Wentworth whispered that I had feigned innocence to ensnare a duke. Lady Merrill murmured that I had played the shy sister for sympathy, and the worst of all came from Lady Wexby, whose shrill voice carried through the modiste shop as she declared, "It is always the quiet ones who prove the most conniving." My mother, hearing these rumors second-hand, turned her frustration upon me with increasing severity. "You must not confront Clarissa," she said sharply when I dared to suggest speaking with my sister. "Do not stir matters worse than they already are. The only way to survive this is silence." But silence had become its own prison. I could not escape Clarissa's glare at home, the way she looked at me as though I were responsible for the wreckage of her own making. And yet beneath her anger, I sometimes sensed something almost desperate, as if seeing me finally noticed had struck at a fear she had buried so deeply she could hardly name it. Clarissa's campaign reached its peak 2 nights later at Lady Penwick's soirée, where I arrived only because my mother insisted that hiding would make matters worse. From the moment I entered the candlelit drawing room, conversations fractured like thin ice beneath a boot. No one met my eyes. No one greeted me save for a strained nod or stiff smile. Even those I had known since childhood avoided my presence, as though scandal were contagious. Clarissa, radiant in amber silk, glided through the crowd collecting sympathy with the ease of practiced artistry, hand to her heart, lashes lowered, voice trembling just enough to enchant. "I forgive her," she told one dowager loudly enough for me to hear, "for she knows not what she does." Heat surged behind my eyes, humiliation coiling like a fist in my stomach. The worst part was that I could not defend myself without appearing precisely as manipulative as they accused me of being. I stood near a darkened corner, wishing desperately to disappear, when I overheard a whisper just behind me. "They say the Duke only noticed her because she threw herself at him." A laugh followed. A cruel, dismissive sound. I swallowed hard, feeling the room tilt. I should have left. I should have fled, but my feet would not move. And it was in that moment, when I felt the weight of every false rumor pressing against my ribs like a crushing hand, that I realized Clarissa had not simply sought revenge. She had declared war, and society, hungry for spectacle, had eagerly joined her side. It was 2 afternoons after Lady Penwick's soirée, when the sting of whispered cruelty still clung to my skin like smoke, that Adrian Ravenscar sought me out with a determination that both startled and unsettled me. I had retreated to the farthest corner of Lady Farnsworth's tea gathering, a modest affair I attended only because my mother insisted I must show my face if I wished to salvage even a scrap of reputation. Yet I quickly realized my presence only fueled more murmurs. Women gathered in tight clusters, glancing at me from behind fluttering fans, their voices pitched just low enough to feign civility. I sat alone at a small round table near a window, overlooking the frost-dusted lawn, hands wrapped around a cooling teacup, trying to steady my breath. Then the room shifted. I did not see him enter. I only sensed the change in atmosphere as conversations faltered and heads turned toward the doorway. Adrian stood there, tall and composed, scanning the room with an intensity that made it painfully clear whom he sought. And when his gaze found mine, something like relief, quiet, unmistakable, softened the hard lines of his expression. He walked toward me with long, purposeful strides, ignoring the startled stares and half-curtsies that rippled in his wake. The moment he reached my table, every whisper died. "Lady Emilia," he said gently, lowering his voice as though the room did not exist. "May I sit with you?" I could not speak. I merely nodded, feeling my world tilt as he took the chair beside mine rather than the one across from me. The proximity was deliberate, a shield he placed between me and the prying eyes surrounding us. My heart thudded chaotically. "I came," he began, "because I owe you an apology far greater than the one I attempted in the conservatory." His words struck me with quiet force. "Your Grace," I murmured, "you do not owe me." "I owe you everything," he said, voice low enough only I could hear. "I dragged you into this storm by failing to control my actions and by failing to foresee how cruel society could be." His jaw tightened. "I should have protected you." The sincerity in his eyes was almost unbearable. Pain, anger, regret woven so tightly together I hardly dared breathe. "You did nothing wrong," I whispered. "You simply ended an engagement that was already broken. And in doing so," he murmured, "I made you the target of their hunger for scandal." His gaze drifted over the room, where women pretended not to stare while clearly straining to hear. "They wish to punish someone," he said, "and you were the easiest to wound." A sharp ache bloomed behind my ribs. "I have grown used to being invisible," I whispered. "I never expected being seen to be worse." His expression softened with something like anguish. "If I could take their eyes off you and place them upon myself, I would." He paused. "Emilia, I seek your forgiveness, but more than that, I seek your trust." My breath caught. Trust. A word so delicate, so dangerous. "Why?" I whispered. He exhaled slowly. "Because your kindness has unsettled me more than any of their cruelty." Before I could answer, the room erupted again in whispers. Clarissa had arrived. Her gaze locked onto us, fury blazing like an exposed flame. The fragile moment shattered, but not before something unspoken and irrevocable passed between us, something that felt like the faint, flickering beginning of a spark. The cruelty that settled over the next week did not arrive abruptly. It crept like a slow frost across every corner of my life, turning familiar places brittle and hostile. At first it was only a few stares, lingering too long to be polite. Then came the silences, those dreadful, suffocating silences that fell whenever I approached a small circle of ladies, their conversations dissolving into tight smiles and murmured excuses, their eyes glittering with judgment they no longer bothered to hide. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it would fade as all scandals eventually did. But each day brought something sharper. The invitation from Lady Ravenscar was rescinded due to unavoidable circumstances. Lady Kincaid, who once praised my embroidery, passed me at the dressmaker's with a sniff that suggested I had stepped on her hem. Even old friends from my schoolroom years avoided my gaze, as though acknowledging me might somehow stain their reputations. The worst blow came when I stepped into the morning parlor one quiet afternoon and found my mother pale and trembling over the latest gossip sheet. Without looking at me, she pushed the paper forward with stiff fingers. "Do not faint," she whispered, though her own voice was close to breaking. I unfolded the paper, breath-catching when I saw the sketch dominating the front page. It was me, but twisted, exaggerated, cruel. I was depicted reaching toward the Duke of Ravenscar like some desperate vine, my expression scheming and sly, while Clarissa shone in the foreground, radiant and wronged. Beneath it, the headline declared, "The Shadow Sister Strikes, a plain girl's ambitious trap." The room spun. My mother began to pace, her hands shaking violently. "How could you allow this?" she cried. "You should have refused his attentions from the start. You should have—" "I never sought his attention," I whispered, unable to lift my eyes. "I never asked for any of this." "Intentions do not matter," she snapped. "Only what is written." I felt myself shrinking, folding inward, fighting tears with every breath. But before my mother could continue, my father appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. He took the paper, studied the caricature with an unreadable face, then folded it quietly. "Enough," he said. "Blame will not change what has been printed." Yet he did not look at me. That, more than his words, carved a hollow ache through my chest. I retreated to my room, seeking solitude, but solitude offered no comfort. The caricature burned behind my eyelids, replaying again and again until I pressed a hand to my mouth to stifle a sob. Later that evening, I ventured outside for air, hoping the cold might numb the sting. But as I walked past a pair of young debutantes, they fell immediately into a hushed fit of laughter. "Do you suppose she practiced seducing him in the mirror?" one whispered. "Perhaps she wrote him letters on scented paper," giggled the other. Their words slashed like knives, leaving invisible but searing wounds. I quickened my steps, cheeks burning. I reached the gates just as a carriage rolled past, its occupants peering out with avid interest, hungry to witness the fallen, the shamed, the sister who dared to be seen by a duke. And standing there beneath the weight of the city's judgment, I understood with terrible clarity. Society had decided my guilt, and no truth of mine would ever penetrate their thirst for scandal. I thought the cruelty would crush me entirely, that each whisper, each lingering stare, each silent censure would chip away at what little remained of my confidence until I vanished altogether. But on the night of the Ashford Music Hale, when the ridicule had reached its sharpest edge and I had begun to shrink into myself with every passing hour, the world shifted in a way so startling, so impossible, that I felt the breath leave my body. My mother insisted I attend, determined to prove that the Hale family still had pride, but I had never felt less proud, standing at the edge of the glittering ballroom with my hands clasped tightly at my waist, praying no one would approach. No one did. They only observed from afar, with the hungry interest of those watching a carriage accident. Conversations flickered and dimmed whenever I drifted near, and more than once I caught a flash of mockery behind a silk fan. I tried to remain composed, but humiliation pressed against my ribs until my pulse stuttered. Clarissa, luminous in emerald green, stood surrounded by admirers. She had regained some of her sparkle, preening subtly as she watched me wilt at the edges of the room. I lowered my gaze. If I could become invisible again, truly invisible, I would have. But then a hush rippled through the ballroom. It moved like wind across a field, soft and sudden, lifting every gaze toward the entrance. I turned, despite myself. Adrian Ravenscar stood in the doorway, tall and solemn, scanning the crowd with an intensity that stole the warmth from my fingertips. He was dressed in deep midnight blue, the candlelight catching the stark contrast of his dark hair and pale, unyielding expression. Conversation stilled. The orchestra faltered. Even Clarissa's smile wavered. And then he moved. Not toward Clarissa, as everyone expected, not toward the host, not toward any of the dazzling women who openly angled their bodies to catch his attention. He walked toward me. Each step he took seemed to echo, though the floor was carpeted, though the music sputtered back to life in a confused flutter. People parted without being asked, their shock and almost physical force in the air. Clarissa stiffened, her fan clattering against her skirts. My breath seized. Adrian did not slow, did not falter, did not acknowledge a single person who attempted to intercept him. When he reached me, he paused only long enough for the corner of his mouth to soften into something like relief. "Lady Emilia," he said gently, offering his arm. "If you are willing, may I escort you inside?" My pulse thundered. "Your Grace, I do not think." "Then allow me to think for us both," he murmured, quiet enough for only me to hear. "I will not let them hunt you." A tremor ran through me. The room watched with bated breath, the murmurs rising like an invisible storm. Clarissa's eyes blazed with disbelief and something darker, fear. I placed my hand on his arm, a single, trembling choice. And the moment I did, the entire music hall inhaled sharply as though witnessing a scandal being born in real time. But for the first time in weeks, the weight pressing down on my shoulders eased, not because the world had forgiven me, but because Adrian Ravenscar had chosen, without hesitation, to stand beside me. And as he led me into the center of the room, the whispers that followed us did not break me. They only made his quiet, unwavering presence feel all the more extraordinary. The moment Adrian guided me into the Ashford ballroom, the hush that followed was so absolute it felt as though the air itself had thickened, wrapping around us with a strange, trembling awareness. But his presence beside me was steady, unwavering, a silent promise that he would not abandon me to the wolves who watched with sharpened smiles. We remained together for only a few formal greetings. Hostess, host, one startled viscountess whose curtsy nearly toppled her backward, before the scrutiny became unbearable, pressing against my ribs like a tightening corset. My breath hitched. Adrian noticed instantly. "Emilia," he murmured, lowering his head so only I could hear, "you do not have to endure this. If you wish for quiet, say the word." I hesitated, torn between the impulse to flee and the fear of appearing fragile. But his expression, gentle, patient, so unlike the cold mask he wore for society, dissolved my resistance. "A moment, away from all this," I whispered. His hand flexed beneath mine, not in possession but in reassurance. He led me through the crowd with ease, as though he knew every hidden passage of the estate. We slipped behind a velvet curtain, past a dim hallway lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, and into a small library tucked away like a secret. The door clicked shut behind us. Silence. Warm, golden lamplight spilled across shelves of leather-bound volumes, casting soft shadows that made the room feel cocooned, untouched by gossip or expectation. I exhaled shakily, only then realizing how tightly I had been holding myself. Adrian watched me, concern tightening the lines around his eyes. "I should not have brought you so openly," he murmured. "I saw their cruelty. I should have found another way." "I do not regret coming," I said, surprising both of us with the truth of it. "Only being seen." He stepped closer, not enough to touch, but enough that the warmth of him reached me, subtle and grounding. "You deserve to be seen," he replied. "Not as they paint you, not as their whispers demand, but as you are." My heart fluttered painfully. "And how do you see me, Your Grace?" His breath caught. For a moment, the world narrowed to the space between us, charged and fragile. "As a woman far kinder than this world deserves," he said quietly. "As someone who listens, even when silence hurts. As someone who unsettles me more than I have words for." My pulse thundered. I turned away toward the shelves, needing distance, needing breath, but he followed with unhurried steps. "The night of the ball," I whispered, "when you called my name, did you mean to?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. It was the only honest thing in that room. The confession struck with such force that I felt unsteady. He reached out as though to steady me, then stopped himself, his hand hovering inches from mine. The restraint in that gesture, in him, was so unexpectedly intimate that it stole my breath. A crackle of thunder rolled outside, the storm gathering sooner than expected. The library lights flickered. The moment stretched, taut as a string pulled to breaking. Slowly, deliberately, Adrian lifted his hand again, this time brushing a loose curl behind my ear, his fingertips soft against my skin. I trembled. He leaned in, breath warm near my cheek. Our lips hovered a breath apart, so close I could feel the promise of a kiss neither of us had dared to imagine. And then, footsteps in the hallway. Voices. The spell shattered like thin glass. We parted instantly, breathless, trembling, both aware that something irrevocable had nearly happened. But the truth remained, bright and terrifying. For the first time in my life, I wanted to be seen, and for the first time in his, Adrian Ravenscar was looking only at me. I returned home from the Ashford Musicale, with my pulse still unsteady, my thoughts tangled in the memory of Adrian's almost kiss, the warmth of his hand, brushing that loose curl behind my ear, the look in his eyes that made the world outside the library fade to nothing. But the moment I stepped through the front doors of Hale House, the fragile glow inside me dimmed beneath the heavy atmosphere waiting like a trap. My mother stood rigid at the foot of the staircase, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line, while my father lingered in the shadows behind her, arms folded in a gesture I had rarely seen him use, except when addressing grave financial matters. Clarissa stood between them, still wearing her gown from the musicale, untouched and flawless, but her expression was a volatile mixture of triumph and devastation. "Emilia," my mother said sharply, "we need a word." The tone made my shoulders stiffen. Before I could respond, she swept into the drawing room with clipped steps that demanded I follow. My father shut the door behind us, the click echoing through the room like a verdict. I stood before them, my heart beating far too fast, the hush of the house amplifying every uneasy breath. Clarissa moved first, her gaze like a blade. "Do you have any idea," she hissed, "what you have done?" What?" I whispered, bewildered by the hostility vibrating from her. My mother thrust the evening's gossip sheet into my hands. I didn't need to read it to know what it contained. Another sketch, another sensational headline, another twist of the truth designed to paint me as a scheming, shameless sister grasping for a duke's attention. But what I didn't expect was the added venom. The duke's new favorite, the plain sister who knows how to ensnare. My stomach dropped. My father spoke, voice low and stern. "You allowed him to escort you. You let the ton see you alone with him. Do you have any understanding of the damage this causes our family?" "I did not allow anything," I whispered, heat rising behind my eyes. I did not ask him to approach me. But you did not refuse him, Clarissa snapped. You could have stepped away. You could have avoided him. Instead, you lingered like— Enough, I said, and the word surprised even me. It was strained, trembling, but it cut through her cruelty. A tremor of silence followed. My mother took a step forward, her expression hardening. You will not speak to your sister in such a tone. Then she must not accuse me of sins I did not commit, I replied, voice steadier than I felt. I have done nothing wrong, and I will not apologize for things invented by others. Clarissa laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. Nothing wrong? He ignored me all night to chase after you. Do you understand how that makes me look? This is not about how it makes you look, I said, my voice rising before I could stop it. This is about choices you made, long before I ever stepped near him. A flicker of panic crossed her face, quickly masked by anger, but my father intervened with a firm, weary sigh. Enough. This arguing serves no one. Yet as I looked at them, all three, staring as though I were the cause of our family's unraveling, I felt something inside me break free. I realized in that moment I had spent years shrinking myself so Clarissa could shine, so my mother could claim harmony, so my father could avoid conflict. But not anymore. I will not be your scapegoat, I whispered, the truth trembling but resolute. Not any longer. And for the first time in my life I walked out of that room without waiting for permission. Adrian Ravenscar had never been a man easily shaken, but the night after the Ashford musicale found him standing alone in his study at Ravenscar Manor, staring into the dying embers of the hearth as though the faint glow might offer answers he could not find within himself. The storm outside rattled against the tall windows, wind sweeping through the eaves like a warning, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were consumed, not with Clarissa, not with the scandal, not even with the merciless scrutiny of the ton, but with the memory of Emilia's trembling breath in the dimly lit library, the fragile courage in her eyes, the way she had looked at him as though she feared the world, but trusted him despite it. Trust. The word clung to him like a weight. He had nearly kissed her. The admission sent a jolt through him even now, hours later, standing in the quiet of his ancestral home with shadows pooling along the walls. He had nearly kissed Emilia Hale, not out of duty, not out of sympathy, but out of a pull so fierce he felt it in his bones. He raked a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. When the study door opened, he did not need to turn to know it was Lord Carraway. His closest friend stepped inside with the ease of a man who had known Adrian since boyhood, his expression both concerned and resigned. You have been hiding in here for hours, Carraway remarked, pouring himself a measure of brandy before settling into a nearby chair. I assume this has something to do with the musicale. It does, Adrian muttered, leaning one hand against the edge of the desk. And with Emilia Hale. Carraway's brows lifted with sharp interest. So the rumors are true. Rumors rarely grasp the truth, Adrian said darkly. They twist it into something grotesque. And what is the truth? Carraway asked, voice calm but probing. Adrian hesitated, the words lodged painfully in his chest. But he had never been one to hide from truth, not even when it threatened to expose his vulnerabilities. She is nothing like Clarissa, he said finally. Emilia listens. She speaks softly but with clarity. She sees more than most people care to notice. She is kind in a way that unsettles me. Carraway studied him over the rim of his glass. Unsettles you, he repeated. That is a word I have never heard you use. Adrian ignored the remark. I caused her harm, he continued, pacing now, the floor creaking beneath his steps. Not intentionally, but harm nonetheless. Society lashes at her because of my choices. They see her as an easy target. Every insult aimed at her feels like a blade drawn across my own skin. Carraway set his glass down with a soft thud. Adrian, he said quietly, are you falling in love with her? The question struck the air like a crack of thunder. Adrian froze. For a heartbeat, he could not breathe. Love. He had thought himself immune to it after Clarissa's betrayal, after years of believing affection was merely another currency to be manipulated. But the image of Emilia, her quiet strength, her trembling defiance, her vulnerability, rose unbidden, filling his chest with something fierce and aching. Slowly, painfully, he answered. I do not know, he whispered. But I fear. I am already half undone. Carraway exhaled, leaning back in his chair. Then tread carefully. The ton will use her against you. Clarissa will not go quietly. And Emilia, his voice gentled, is not built to be broken. Adrian turned toward the window, watching the storm lash at the darkness beyond. "Then I will not let them break her," he said, voice low and certain. "Even if it costs me everything." And with those words, something inside him settled. Not peace, not clarity, but resolve, cold and unyielding. He could not yet name the depth of his feelings for Emilia, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he would protect her, no matter the price. The charity sewing circle had always been one of the few social gatherings where I felt something close to ease. The room was typically filled with soft murmurs, gentle laughter, and the rhythmic whisper of thread gliding through fabric, an environment where silence was not suspicious and quietness was not judged. But on the morning Clarissa decided to confront me there, even the needle between my fingers trembled. I had come early, hoping to avoid too many watchful eyes, choosing a seat near the window where pale winter sunlight spilled across the table. For a brief moment, the warmth soothed me. I let my fingers settle into familiar patterns, stitching delicate petals into a handkerchief destined for the infirmary. Then I felt it, the shift in the room, the tightening of air, the subtle hush that accompanied a predator's approach. Clarissa glided toward me with her usual grace, but her smile was sharper than any knife. Several ladies straightened in their seats, sensing drama, their needles slowing as they pretended to concentrate. Clarissa stopped at my table, folding her hands with a deceptive softness. "Emilia," she said sweetly, "I cannot imagine what you hoped to accomplish by attending today." I forced my gaze to remain steady. "I came to sew, Clarissa, nothing more." She leaned down, her voice dropping to a whisper meant to wound. "You came to gather pity, perhaps, or to make yourself look innocent. But surely you know the ton sees right through that." I drew in a slow breath, keeping my needle still so it wouldn't betray the trembling beneath my skin. "I'm not pretending anything," I whispered. "I simply want peace." Clarissa's eyes flashed, her composure cracking like porcelain. "Peace? After you destroyed my engagement?" My heart clenched. "I destroyed nothing. Your actions—" "Do not," she hissed, "speak of my actions as though you understand anything about what I lost." Her words trembled, and for a heartbeat I glimpsed something raw in her expression, not anger, but fear. Fear of being unchosen, fear of being overshadowed, fear that perhaps she was not as beloved as she always believed. Clarissa straightened, smoothing her skirts with shaking hands. "You were always there, weren't you? In the corner, watching, waiting. You may pretend you never desired attention, but the moment it came, you clutched it with greedy hands." I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of every stare around us. "I never wanted his attention," I said softly but firmly. "And you know it." She laughed bitterly, loud enough for others to hear. "Do I? Because it seems to me that the moment his grace looked your way, you bloomed like some pathetic winter flower desperate for warmth." The cruelty stung, sharp as a thorn-piercing skin. But for once, I did not shrink. "I am not your enemy," I whispered, meeting her gaze fully. "I never have been." Her breath hitched at the honesty in my voice, her expression flickering with confusion, anger, and something dangerously close to heartbreak. "You will never have him," she said finally, her voice nearly trembling. "I will not allow it." I looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "Clarissa," I replied gently, "what happens between Adrian and me is no longer yours to command." Silence fell, heavy and stunned. Clarissa's eyes widened in shock, perhaps because I had never spoken back to her, perhaps because I had spoken the truth she feared most. With a sharp sweep of her skirts, she turned and walked away, leaving behind a room full of women pretending not to listen. My needle finally slipped from my fingers, landing softly on the table. But my heart, fragile, aching, felt strangely steadier than it had in weeks. Clarissa's cruelty had not broken me. It had revealed something I had never allowed myself to see. I was stronger than the shadow I had lived in, and I would no longer be silent simply because she demanded it. The carriage ride that afternoon was meant to be uneventful, a simple errand to deliver blankets to a parish home beyond the edge of town, nothing more. I welcomed the quiet escape, glad for a few hours away from London's suffocating gossip. The sky hung low and pale, thick with the promise of snow, and the air was sharp enough to sting my cheeks when I leaned toward the small carriage window. The rhythm of the wheels over the uneven country road lulled me into a rare pocket of calm, and for the first time in weeks, my shoulders loosened. But tranquility proved fleeting. A sudden jolt, violent, wrenching, threw me sideways as the carriage lurched with a sickening crack. The wheels skidded, the horses shrieked, and before I could brace myself, the entire carriage tilted sharply into a shallow ditch. My breath knocked from my lungs as I hit the opposite bench, my vision blurring. The horses stomped and snorted in panic above us. "Miss Emilia," the footman shouted from the front seat. "The wheels splintered. Badly. Stay inside." His voice trembled, and cold dread curled through me. The road was empty, nothing but skeletal trees and wind stretching in both directions. Snow began to fall, soft flakes at first, then heavier, swirling like a curtain of white. I tried to gather my breath as the footman climbed down, cursing under his breath as he examined the damage. Moments later, another crack echoed, and he cried out, a harsh, pained sound. I pushed open the carriage door. "Are you hurt?" I called. He sat slumped near the wheel, gripping his ankle with a strained grimace. "Twisted, miss. I can't walk on it." Panic gnawed at my ribs. We were stranded. The cold deepened, the sky darkened, and then the distant thunder of hooves rolled through the stillness. I froze, clutching the carriage door frame as a lone rider emerged through the falling snow, a tall figure on a dark horse, cloak billowing like a shadow. My heart lurched. Adrian Ravenscar. He reined in sharply when he saw the overturned carriage. "Emilia?" he called, urgency cracking through his voice. "Are you injured?" I shook my head, dazed. "No, only shaken." But the footman. Adrian dismounted before I could finish. In 3 swift strides he was at the footman's side, assessing the injury with calm efficiency before turning to me. "You cannot remain here," he said, voice low but firm. "The storm is worsening." Snowflakes clung to his hair, his coat, the sharp line of his jaw. His presence, steady, strong, broke through my fear like a lantern in the dark. "Come," he said, offering his gloved hand. "I will take you to shelter." I hesitated, glancing at the injured footman. "He will ride in the carriage once I secure it," Adrian assured me. "I will send for help immediately." The storm whipped around us in fierce gusts, and I knew he was right. Trembling, I placed my hand in his. The warmth of his grip wrapped around mine, grounding me. He lifted me onto his horse with a gentleness that made my breath catch, then mounted behind me, his arm bracing firmly around my waist as he guided the horse forward. The world blurred into white, the cold biting my cheeks, the wind tugging at my cloak, but all I felt was the steady, unyielding presence of Adrian Ravenscar holding me close as we rode through the storm. And in that terrifying, breathless moment, I understood with startling clarity that safety had a shape, and it felt exactly like him. By the time Adrian guided the horse beneath the sweeping arch of Ravenscar Manor's stone entryway, my entire body trembled, not only from the cold that had seeped through my cloak, but from the closeness of him, the silent strength that had anchored me as the storm swallowed the world behind us. Snow clung to my lashes, my hair, the folds of my gown. The wind had reddened my cheeks to a shade that felt almost feverish. Adrian dismounted first, then lifted me down with hands so steady, so careful, that the moment my feet touched the ground I nearly leaned back into him from sheer instinct. We hurried inside before the gale could swallow us again, the heavy doors closing with a resonant thud that shut out the storm but not the rapid beat of my pulse. Warmth enveloped me at once, the glow of candles flickering along the high walls, the faint scent of burning oak in the air. Adrian turned to one of the servants who hurried forward. "See to the footman immediately," he instructed. "Prepare a room for him and summon the physician if needed." His voice held a note of command, but also a gentleness that reminded me he was not the cold, distant Duke the Ton pretended to know. He was something different, someone different, when he spoke softly, when he looked at me the way he was looking at me now, as though making sure I was truly unhurt. "Emilia," he said, stepping closer, "are you certain you are not injured?" "Only startled," I whispered, though my voice wavered. "I am grateful you found us." "I did not find you," he murmured. "I was returning from my tenant farms. Fate simply intervened." Fate. The word fluttered through me like a warm current. A servant brought blankets, and Adrian guided me into a grand sitting room. The winter storm outside roared against the windows, rattling the panes as though furious at being denied entry. Inside, however, the world felt unexpectedly intimate. Adrian lit more candles, then knelt by the hearth to coax the fire into a steady blaze. Watching him there, coat dusted with melting snow, dark hair tousled, strong hands working patiently at the kindling, unsettled something deep within me. He looked nothing like the untouchable Duke society feared. He looked like a man capable of warmth, of tenderness, of vulnerability. "You will stay here tonight," he said once the flames rose high enough to warm the room. He stood and shed his coat, revealing the dark waistcoat beneath, tailored yet softened by the glow of the fire. "The roads are impossible, the carriage unusable. I will arrange separate rooms, of course." He paused, as though the propriety of the moment rested entirely on the way he uttered that last word. I nodded, though my heart thrummed with the strange, breathless awareness that we were alone in his home, stormbound, sheltered, unseen by the world that always watched too closely. A roll of thunder shook the walls. I flinched before I could stop myself. Adrian's expression softened, and he motioned to the settee before the fire. "Sit," he said gently. "You are shivering." I sank onto the cushions, the blazing hearth warming my chilled hands. He sat beside me, not too close, not too far, just enough that the heat of him reached me like a quiet, steady pulse. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the storm filling the silence with its restless music. Then he did something I did not expect. He removed his gloves slowly, thoughtfully, and rested his bare hand atop the blanket that covered mine, not touching, but close enough that the warmth reached my skin. "I feared something had happened to you," he said, voice low. "When I saw the carriage overturned, I have never known such dread." My breath caught. "You should not worry so deeply over me." His jaw tightened. "I cannot help it." The firelight flickered across his features, carving shadows and light in ways that made his expression almost unbearably sincere. For a heartbeat, one long, suspended heartbeat, I felt the truth of something beautiful and dangerous blooming between us. And though propriety stood like a thin, brittle barrier, the storm outside made layers of boundaries. Because in that quiet moment, wrapped in warmth and fear and relief, I realized that I was not afraid of being close to him. I was afraid of how desperately I no longer wanted to step away. Dawn crept into Ravenscar Manor with a pale, reluctant light, the storm having exhausted itself into a hush of white that blanketed the hills and softened every harsh edge of the world. I woke in a warm guest chamber arranged hastily the night before, the fire reduced to glowing embers and the sound of distant footsteps whispering through the corridors. For a fleeting moment, I forgot where I was. Then memory flooded back, the crash of the carriage, Adrian's hand pulling me up onto his horse, the quiet intimacy of the firelit sitting room. Heat curled through my chest, a dangerous warmth that lingered long after sleep had faded. A maid entered with a gentle knock, carrying a tray of tea and a note sealed with the Ravenscar crest. "His Grace asked that you receive this as soon as you woke," she said before slipping out again. My pulse quickened as I broke the seal. "I will not disturb your rest. When you are ready, I will escort you home. A.R." The simplicity of it stirred something fragile and foolish in me. After dressing with hands that trembled more than they should have, I followed the servant downstairs. The house felt different in daylight, less imposing, more human, as though the storm had stripped away layers of grandeur to reveal the warmth beneath. I found Adrian in the front hall speaking with the physician who attended to the injured footman. His shoulders eased visibly when he saw me, the tension around his eyes softening into something dangerously close to relief. "Lady Emilia," he said, stepping toward me, "I trust you rested well." "I did," I managed, though the truth was more complicated. I had slept, yes, but rest had been elusive. My thoughts tangled around the memory of his nearness, and the footman, his expression gentled. "He will heal quickly. I've arranged for him to remain here for several days." A silence followed, soft, tentative, before he spoke again, voice lower. "I regret that you were caught in the storm. I should have ridden with you. I should have—" "You saved us," I said quietly. "That is what I will remember." Something flickered across his features, a spark of emotion too raw for a duke accustomed to restraint. Yet propriety hovered between us like a thin veil, reminding us of the world waiting outside these walls. He offered his arm with careful distance. "The roads have cleared enough for safe travel. If you are ready, I will take you home." Ready. I was not ready at all, not to return to London's ridicule, not to face my family's accusations, not to walk away from the strange, fragile haven that last night had created. But his expression held no pressure, only consideration, and I found myself nodding. The carriage rolled through the snow, covered countryside, the world beyond hushed and bright. Adrian sat across from me, his posture formal but his eyes speaking in unguarded, silent threads. Every bump of the road, every shift of light across his face, made it harder to ignore the truth blooming quietly between us. Something tender, something dangerous. Something neither of us understood yet could no longer deny. When we reached the Hale residence, he stepped out first and extended his hand to help me descend. The moment my fingers touched his, a current passed between us, too brief and too powerful. "Emilia," he said softly, "I fear last night has changed far more than the weather." I withdrew my hand before I did something reckless, like hold on. "Yes," I whispered. "It has." And as the door closed behind me, the quiet of my family's house felt colder than the storm itself. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to leave warmth behind. The days after my return from Ravenscar Manor moved with a strange, muffled heaviness, as though London itself were holding its breath, waiting to see what new humiliation might fall upon me. The gossip had not lessened. If anything, the sight of me arriving home in a Ravenscar carriage had reignited the tongue's appetite for speculation. My mother refused to speak of it, moving through rooms with clipped steps and averted eyes, while my father buried himself in ledgers to avoid acknowledging the scandal entirely. Clarissa, however, watched me with a simmering fury barely contained by brittle poise. I avoided her gaze whenever possible. I no longer had the strength to absorb the venom she carried like perfume. 3 days passed this way, the household tense and silent. I kept mostly to my room, trying to quiet the swirl of emotions that rose without permission. Memories of Adrian's steady hands guiding me through the storm, the warmth of his voice in the firelit sitting room, the way his eyes softened when they met mine in the dawn-lit hall. I told myself such thoughts were foolish, dangerous, but they lingered like faint embers that refused to die. On the 4th morning, as I sat at my vanity attempting to arrange my hair into something that resembled composure, a footman knocked at my door. His face was pale, his posture unnaturally stiff. "A message for you, miss," he said, holding out a sealed envelope. My heart lurched when I saw the crest pressed into the wax. Ravenscar. My fingers shook as I broke the seal. "Lady Emilia, if it would not cause you discomfort, I wish to request your company at the Winter Solstice Gala as my honored guest. The event will be highly scrutinized. Still, I would not ask if I did not believe your presence would be both meaningful and welcome. The decision is entirely yours. Adrian Ravenscar." Meaningful. Welcome. My breath trembled. Never in my life had I been invited to a grand event as anything but an afterthought or a companion to Clarissa. Never had anyone chosen me. I read the letter again, feeling heat rise beneath my skin, but joy quickly tangled with dread. The Solstice Gala was one of the most prestigious gatherings of the season. The entire aristocracy would attend, and Adrian was asking me, the center of gossip, the painted villain of caricatures, to walk beside him in full view of the world. A quiet knock sounded behind me. Clarissa stepped into the room without invitation, her gaze darting to the letter in my hands. Her eyes narrowed with a cold, inward twist. "He invited you," she said flatly, as though confirming a betrayal she had long suspected. "He truly intends to throw you into the lion's den wearing his colors." "Clarissa, do not pretend innocence," she snapped. "Do you have any idea what this means? What they will say about you if you go? What they will say about him?" I swallowed, unable to answer, because I knew. Going with him would ignite a scandal far worse than anything that had come before, but refusing felt like extinguishing something rare and fragile growing inside me. Something that felt dangerously like hope. Clarissa's voice softened, not with kindness but with fear. "If you attend that gala on his arm, Emilia, there will be no turning back. You will be tied to him in the eyes of every whispering tongue in London." I looked down at Adrian's letter, at the clear, steady handwriting that seemed to reach out to me like an offered hand in the dark. "The decision is entirely yours." For the first time in my life, a choice lay before me that belonged to no one else. Not my mother, not Clarissa, not society, only me. Slowly, with a breath that trembled through my entire body, I whispered the words that terrified me even as they set something inside me free. "I will go." Clarissa's breath hitched, a sharp, wounded sound, before she turned and fled. I remained still, clutching the letter to my chest, feeling the weight and wonder of what I had just chosen. And somewhere deep within me, beneath the fear and uncertainty, something bloomed with quiet, irrevocable certainty. Whatever awaited me at the Winter Solstice Gala, I would face it, because Adrian Ravenscar had asked. No, invited, and for once, I would not step aside. The days leading up to the Winter Solstice Gala unfolded with the fragile tension of a thread pulled too tightly, every moment vibrating with equal parts fear and anticipation. I had accepted Adrian's invitation, spoken the words aloud, chosen a path I could not retreat from, and yet my confidence wavered with each passing hour. The entire Hale household shifted around me like an unstable tide. My mother oscillated between frantic disbelief and tight-lipped resignation, as though trying to decide whether I was a disaster or an opportunity. My father avoided discussion altogether, burying himself in newspapers he pretended held more importance than the looming spectacle. And Clarissa. Clarissa watched me with the hollow fury of someone witnessing her world tilt irreversibly, her gaze sharp enough to sting whenever it brushed mine. I tried to ignore the heavy silence between us, but it pressed against my ribs like a bruise. The morning of the gala dawned pale and cold, frost blooming across the windows like delicate lace. My maid, Anna, gentle, practical, endlessly patient, insisted on turning the day into something kinder. "You should feel beautiful," she said firmly as she arranged fabrics across the bed. "Not for them, for you." Her words softened the tightness in my throat. We chose a gown of soft winter blue, trimmed with silver embroidery, a color Clarissa would have dismissed as too understated, but one that felt like a reflection of myself, quiet yet luminous in its own way. As Anna worked through the careful ritual of preparing me, curling my hair into loose waves, pinning stray pieces with delicate crystal combs, brushing my cheeks with a hint of warm color, I watched my reflection shift in the mirror. Not transform, exactly, but emerge. My features remained mine, but softened, brightened, as though someone had peeled back a layer of uncertainty and allowed something honest to show. For the first time in my life, I did not feel overshadowed. I felt present. When the carriage hour approached, a tremor of nerves rippled through me. What if the ton mocked me? What if my presence harmed Adrian's standing even more? What if tonight, under the relentless scrutiny of hundreds, he regretted ever inviting me? I smoothed my palms over the skirt of my gown, trying to steady my breathing. Anna placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Whatever happens tonight, you will not face it alone." Her conviction almost unraveled me. The sound of wheels crunching over gravel floated through the window. Adrian's carriage. My pulse leapt. When I stepped into the entry hall, my parents waited stiffly nearby, offering last-minute cautions framed as support. Clarissa stood further back, half, hidden in shadow, her expression unreadable, anger, sorrow, jealousy, perhaps all three. She said nothing. The front doors opened, letting in a rush of cold air and the tall, composed figure of Adrian Ravenscar. His eyes found me immediately, and the soft, stunned warmth that spread across his face dissolved every fear I had harbored. He approached slowly, as though afraid to break the moment by moving too quickly. "Emilia," he said, voice low, "you look." He stopped, breath catching, and tried again. "You look extraordinary." Heat rose to my cheeks, but not from embarrassment, from something deeper, something that curled through me like fire. He offered his arm. I placed my gloved hand atop it, and the world felt strangely steady for the first time in weeks. As we stepped out into the winter evening, lanterns glowing against the snow, I felt the weight of London's gaze waiting at the gala, but I also felt something stronger, the quiet, blooming certainty that whatever awaited me beyond those grand doors, I would face it not as a shadow, not as an afterthought, but as myself, and Adrian Ravenscar would be at my side. The winter solstice gala shimmered like a dream fashioned from frost and candlelight, the grand facade of the Ashbourne estate glowing beneath a canopy of lanterns that cast golden halos onto the fresh snow. Yet as Adrian escorted me toward the towering entrance, every breath I drew felt tight, as though the cold itself pressed against my ribs. The murmurs began before we even reached the steps, soft, startled ripples through the elegantly dressed crowd waiting to be received inside. Fans paused mid-flutter, gloves tightened around arms, heads tilted, eyes widened. The Duke of Ravenscar had arrived, with me. Adrian's hand tightened ever so slightly around mine, a silent reassurance. "Ignore them," he murmured. "They have no claim on your worth." But ignoring the stares proved impossible as the footmen announced our names. His Grace, the Duke of Ravenscar, accompanied by Lady Emilia Hale. The declaration echoed through the marble foyer, and for a moment the world seemed to still. Conversations faltered, glasses froze halfway lifted. Even the orchestra hesitated before recovering. I felt their judgment like cold fingertips on the back of my neck, but Adrian stepped closer, just enough that the warmth of his body brushed against me, guiding me into the glittering ballroom with a calm certainty that steadied my trembling pulse. The scene before us was breathtaking. Hundreds of candles reflecting off crystal chandeliers, garlands of evergreen and white roses lining the walls, and an orchestra playing a soft waltz that wove itself through the air like silk. But all of it blurred as Adrian turned to me, offering his hand. "Dance with me," he said, not as a command, not as a plea, but as something deeper, something dangerously close to an invitation from one soul to another. I placed my hand in his. The moment our palms pressed together, something sparked, quiet but undeniable, like the first crack of a flame in a darkened hearth. He led me onto the polished floor, and the room parted around us, creating a circle of stunned silence. The first steps were tentative. I had not danced in months, and never at the center of attention. But Adrian drew me closer, his hand firm at my waist, guiding me with effortless grace as the music swelled. "You are doing beautifully," he whispered. "They cannot touch you here." I lifted my gaze to his, and everything else faded. His eyes, dark, intent, filled with something that tightened my throat, held mine with such intensity that my fears dissolved, replaced by a soaring, dizzying lightness. Around us, the ballroom watched with thinly veiled astonishment. I felt their shock, their whispers, but for the first time in my life, I did not wither beneath it. I expanded. I shone. Adrian's gaze never left me, as though memorizing every breath, every flutter of my lashes. And in that suspended, glowing moment, I saw what he had tried to hide, how deeply he cared, how fiercely he had tried to resist whatever bound us, and how utterly he had failed. When the final note faded, the room exhaled in a collective murmur that rippled outward. Adrian did not release my hand. "Emilia," he said softly, so quietly it felt like a secret, "you have no idea what you just did to me." My heart fluttered wildly, but before I could respond, movement at the edge of the room caught my attention. Clarissa stood among a cluster of shocked onlookers, her face pale beneath her powdered cheeks, her expression twisting with something raw and volatile. And though the warmth of Adrian's hand still cradled mine, a chill braided itself into my spine. For even in the midst of the most breathtaking moment of my life, I understood, the storm that followed would be unlike anything I had ever faced. But with Adrian standing beside me, the fear did not break me. It only made the moment burn brighter. The applause had scarcely faded from the final note of our dance when a chill slid through the ballroom, not from the winter air creeping beneath the doors, but from the unmistakable sound of a whisper spreading with the venomous speed of wildfire. At first, I sensed only a shift, a tightening of gazes, a ripple of murmurs, a tremor of tension beneath the orchestra's attempt to resume its melody. Adrian stiffened beside me, his hand tightening around mine, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the room for the threat he could already feel stirring. I followed his gaze, heart pounding, and saw a small circle forming near the far end of the ballroom, where Lord and Lady Harriton stood clutching a folded piece of parchment as though it were a live coal. Their faces were flushed with victorious outrage, an expression I had come to recognize too well these past weeks. The parchment passed from hand to hand with alarming eagerness, each person reading, gasping, then turning to stare directly at me. My stomach twisted into a hard knot. Adrian released my hand only long enough to stride toward the cluster, his posture tall and severe, his presence cutting through the crowd like a blade. Those gathered parted reluctantly under the weight of his authority, but none dared stop him as he held out his hand. Lord Harriton placed the parchment into his palm with a self-satisfied flourish, as though gifting him proof of some great crime. Adrian unfolded it slowly, his eyes scanning the lines with icy precision. I watched the moment recognition struck him. His jaw clenched, his breath stilled, the muscles in his throat tightened as though he had swallowed poison. A forged letter, my handwriting mimicked with uncanny accuracy, claiming that I had schemed to manipulate his affection, that I had preyed on his sympathy, that I had set my sights on becoming a duchess by any means necessary, each line more grotesque than the last. My vision blurred, the room tilting as waves of humiliation rolled through me. I knew the truth. I knew who had done this. Clarissa stood at the edge of the circle, her face pale, her eyes gleaming with something between desperation and triumph, her fan trembling ever so slightly. Adrian folded the letter with deliberate slowness before turning. Our eyes met across the sea of onlookers, his filled with conflict, mine with growing terror. He approached me with measured steps, but the space between us felt vast, dangerously fragile. "Emilia," he said quietly, his voice a strained whisper beneath the weight of 100 watching ears, Tell me you did not write this." The hurt in his voice sliced more deeply than the accusation itself. I felt my breath break. "I did not," I whispered, my voice trembling, desperate. "Adrian, I swear." He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, only a heartbeat, but it was enough. Enough for my world to crack. Enough for doubt to flicker across his features like a passing shadow. The smallest hesitation, the faintest fracture of faith. It devastated me. The ballroom spun. The whispers intensified, circling like vultures. Clarissa stepped back into the crowd, her expression unreadable now, satisfaction replaced by something far more hollow. Adrian opened his eyes again, and though he reached out as if to steady me, his hand stopped halfway, suspended in uncertainty. That half gesture, that half trust, shattered what remained of my composure. "I need air," I choked, my voice barely audible. I turned before he could speak, before the ache in his eyes could unravel me entirely. The crowd parted around me, a corridor of judgmental faces and poisonous whispers, each one cutting deeper than the last. And as I fled the ballroom with tears burning behind my eyes, one truth carved itself into my heart with brutal clarity. Adrian Ravenscar had hesitated. He had doubted me. And that single moment, that single flicker of uncertainty, hurt more than every rumor and every whisper the ton had thrown at me combined. I did not remember the walk from the Ashbourne ballroom to the waiting carriage. I only recalled the cold, sharp and merciless against my skin, as though winter itself had reached inside my chest and clenched its fist around my heart. The coachman's startled expression blurred with the glitter of lanterns and the echo of music that no longer sounded beautiful. I gave no instructions. I only whispered, "Home," and the carriage lurched forward, carrying me away from the ballroom, from the stairs, from Adrian's fractured expression, from everything that had briefly made me believe I was becoming someone stronger. My hands trembled in my lap, the forged letters cruel lies burning behind my eyes. But what replayed, over and over, was not the venomous ink. It was Adrian's hesitation, that single pause, that breath where doubt, however fleeting, had eclipsed trust. I pressed a hand to my chest, willing the ache to dull, but it only intensified as we reached Hale House. Inside, the hallways were dark, the servants long asleep. I climbed the stairs quietly, avoiding the creaky steps I had known since childhood, and slipped into my room with the numbness of someone moving through a dream. I packed before dawn, my fingers moving as though guided by instinct rather than thought. A single trunk, a cloak, a letter for my parents informing them I was leaving for the countryside to stay with Aunt Helena. I did not trust myself to face them. I could not bear the questions, or worse, the blame. Clarissa's door stood slightly ajar as I crept down the hall. I did not look inside. I could not. Dawn broke, just as the hired carriage arrived, pale light spilling across the gravel like a reluctant blessing. I stepped inside without looking back, clutching the edge of my cloak as the horses jolted forward. As London receded in the distance, the spires, the fog, the glittering facade that had swallowed me whole, I felt something inside me unravel. Not dramatically, not violently, but quietly, like a thread pulled free from a tapestry that had been unraveling long before I even noticed. Hours later, when the city gave way to the soft rolling hills of the countryside, the tension in my body finally cracked. I pressed my forehead to the cold glass window, letting tears slip silently down my cheeks. I did not cry for the scandal or the whispers, or even Clarissa's cruelty. I cried for the moment my heart had broken, not under society's ridicule, but under the weight of Adrian's doubt. His near kiss in the library had awakened something fragile and hopeful within me. His care during the storm had nurtured it. His invitation to the gala had made it bloom, but his hesitation, however brief, had shattered it. By the time the carriage pulled into my aunt's snow-dusted estate, I felt hollow, scraped clean of the warmth I had only just begun to allow myself. Aunt Helena opened the door with a gasp of concern, gathering me into her arms before I could speak. "Oh, my darling," she whispered into my hair. "You've run from something terrible, haven't you?" I nodded against her shoulder, a quiet, broken sound escaping me. "I had to leave," I managed. There was nothing left for me there. But even as I spoke the words, something deep within me trembled, not with fear, but with mourning, because it was not London I was grieving. It was Adrian, and the part of me that had dared to believe I could be seen. Adrian Ravenscar learned the truth only hours after I fled London, but by then the damage had already carved itself into my life like a scar. He stood in the center of the Ashbourne ballroom, abandoned now except for a few lingering musicians and servants extinguishing candles, holding the forged letter with hands that trembled far more than he would ever admit. Lord Harrowton, flushed with self-importance, lingered nearby until Adrian's voice, low, cold, and dangerously quiet, cut through the silence. "Where did you get this?" Harrowton faltered, suddenly less certain. "It was passed to me by a reliable source." "Name them." The Duke's tone was not a request. It was a command threaded with barely leashed fury, a warning that only a fool would ignore. Harrowton swallowed. Lady Clarissa Hale. The world seemed to still. Every storm Adrian had ever weathered, political betrayal, family tragedy, the slow corrosion of public trust, none of it compared to the brutal certainty striking him now. He turned away without another word, the forged letter crumpling in his fist as he strode from the ballroom. He did not bother with a coat. Rage burned hotter than any cold the night could offer. Clarissa Hale was easily found. She had not left the gala, too intoxicated by the chaos she'd unleashed. She stood in a quiet corridor, trembling, not from remorse, but from the unraveling of control she had sensed all evening. When Adrian approached, she blanched. "Your Grace," she began, attempting a smile. "I can explain." "Can you?" he said softly, lethally. He held out the letter. She stared at it, lips parting. It was a misunderstanding." "Clarissa." His voice cut like a blade. "Did you forge this?" Silence stretched. Her jaw trembled. I only wanted the truth." She closed her eyes, perhaps realizing that here, before him, deceit had no place to hide. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I wrote it." Something inside him broke, not loudly, not visibly, but with a deep internal crack that shook the foundations of the restraint he had built his life upon. "You have ruined her," Adrian said, his voice nearly shaking. "You have driven her from London. You have humiliated her, endangered her reputation, and sought to destroy what little peace she possessed. You have done this not because she wronged you, but because she existed." Clarissa flinched as though struck. "I loved you," she breathed, a desperate confession. "I thought you would look at me the way you looked at her." The words sliced through him, sharp with truth and tragedy. "Whatever kindness remained between us," he said with a quiet finality, "is gone." She reached for him, but he stepped back as if her touch might contaminate the air. "I will not see you again." And with that, he turned and walked away, not toward Ravenscar Manor, not toward political allies or familiar comforts, but toward the stables. Within minutes he was mounted, the horse's hooves striking sparks from the cobblestones as he rode into the winter night. Snow whipped against his coat, wind tearing at his hair, but he did not slow. He rode with the desperation of a man who had too long remained silent, too long allowed propriety to rule his decisions. Emilia had left London, alone, wounded, believing herself betrayed, and his hesitation, his unforgivable flicker of doubt, had helped drive her away. "Hold on," he whispered into the cold air, as if I could hear him across miles of frozen countryside. "Hold on just a little longer." For the first time in his life, Adrian Ravenscar rode not out of duty or honor, but out of aching, undeniable need. He would find me, he would beg forgiveness if he had to, and he would not allow Clarissa's poison to be the final word between us. Snow muffled every sound in my aunt's orchard, turning the world into a quiet, glittering expanse that felt untouched by London's cruelty. I had wandered there out of restlessness, needing the cold to soothe the raw ache in my chest. Each breath rose in pale clouds. Each brittle branch overhead caught the morning light like frozen lace. I wrapped my cloak tighter and let myself imagine, for one fragile moment, that the world had shrunk to this peaceful, lonely place where no one whispered my name with disdain. But peace shattered beneath the frantic pounding of hooves. I turned sharply. A lone rider emerged between the bare trees, dark coat whipping in the wind, horse's breath steaming, snow clinging to his hair. Adrian. My breath caught, my body locked in shock. He dismounted before the horse even stilled, stumbling toward me with a desperation so unguarded, so unlike the composed Duke I had known, that my knees nearly gave out. "Emilia," he said, breathless, voice hoarse from cold and urgency. "Thank God, I found you." I stood frozen, torn between longing and pain, between the instinct to run to him and the instinct to flee. "Why are you here?" I whispered. "After everything, why would you come?" He stopped a few paces from me, chest rising and falling sharply, as though bracing himself for a blow. "Because I failed you," he said simply. "Because I doubted you. For a moment, only a moment, but it was enough to hurt you, and I will never forgive myself for it." My throat tightened. It was more than enough. Snow drifted between us, settling in the folds of his coat, melting on my lashes. His gaze, dark, earnest, raw, held mine without flinching. "Clarissa forged the letter," he said, each word a knife to his own pride. She admitted it. To my face. The orchard spun. Even expecting this truth, hearing it aloud broke something open inside me. "She confessed?" "Yes." His voice cracked. "And I should have known. I should have defended you without hesitation. But when I saw the letter, when I saw your handwriting, fear clawed at me. Fear that I had been deceived again, the way Clarissa deceived me for months." He ran a hand through his snow, damp hair, anguish tightening his features. "I allowed my past to make me doubt you. And that doubt," his voice faltered, "it was unforgivable. Tears stung my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. You hurt me, Adrian, more deeply than any rumor ever could." He closed the distance between us by a single step, not touching, just close enough that his warmth brushed the air around me. "Emilia," he said softly, "I am not asking for your forgiveness. I am asking for the chance to earn it." The sincerity in his voice, aching, unguarded, stripped of every shield he ever carried, fractured something inside me. "I left London," I whispered. "I didn't think you would come after me." A soft, painful laugh escaped him. "I would have searched every mile of England if I had to." Silence wrapped around us like falling snow, gentle, heavy, breathless. "Tell me honestly," I said, voice trembling, "why are you here?" He stepped closer, close enough that I felt his breath warm against the cold air. Close enough that the ache in my chest ignited into something fragile and bright. "Because," he said, his voice low and steady and terrifyingly real, "I care for you, deeply, more than I ever intended, more than I know how to control." My breath hitched. Snow fell softly between us, melting before it touched the ground. "Emilia," he murmured, "if you tell me to leave, I will. But if you ask me to stay, I will never walk away again." And there, in the stillness of the winter orchard, with my heart trembling in my chest, I realized that I could no longer hide from what lived in the space between us. Beautiful, painful, undeniable. For one suspended heartbeat, the world held its breath. Snow drifted between us in slow, weightless spirals, catching in Adrian's dark hair and melting on my lips where they trembled with words I could not yet speak. He stood so close I could feel the warmth radiating from him, a fragile barrier against the icy air, and every shard of pain I had carried since the winter solstice gala seemed to throb in time with my pulse. His confession lingered between us like a living thing, raw, exposed, impossible to ignore. He cared for me, more than he intended, more than he could control. The truth of it shivered through me, tender and terrifying. I had imagined this moment in fevered fragments during sleepless nights, but no imagining prepared me for the reality of his voice trembling, of his gaze stripped of every layer of distance and duty. Slowly, cautiously, as though moving closer might break the delicate balance between us, Adrian lifted his hand and brushed his fingertips against my cheek. The touch was feather, light yet devastating, melting through my defenses with alarming ease. I inhaled sharply, my breath catching in my throat. "Emilia," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, "I am not afraid of scandal. I am not afraid of what society will say. The only thing I fear is losing you before I ever had the chance to prove myself worthy of you." My eyes fluttered shut. Every word he spoke carved into me, warm and agonizing at once. When I opened my eyes again, he was watching me with a quiet intensity that made every inch of my skin feel too warm despite the cold. His hand slid behind my jaw, gentle but sure, drawing me closer. My pulse stuttered. I leaned forward, only a little, only enough for my breath to mingle with his in soft, trembling clouds. One more inch, one more breath. The world narrowed to the space between our lips, and then, "Emilia, child, where are you?" The voice sliced through the orchard like a blade. Adrian froze. I jerked back as though awakened from a dream, heat flooding my cheeks in a rush of mortified clarity. My aunt's voice floated closer, accompanied by the crunch of hurried footsteps through the snow. "Emilia," she called again, breathless. "There you are." "Oh." She stopped short at the sight of us. Her eyes widened in startled comprehension, darting from my flushed face to Adrian's tense posture. For one agonizing moment, none of us moved. Adrian stepped back with visible reluctance, the sudden cold air between us, a sharp, painful contrast. I felt the loss immediately, like stepping from fire into frost. My aunt pressed a hand to her chest, embarrassment and concern warring in her expression. "Forgive me," she murmured. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "There is nothing to forgive," Adrian said, though his voice was tight with the truth of how very much she had interrupted. I swallowed, heart pounding. Shame, longing, fear, and something dangerously close to relief tangled inside me. Without the interruption, I would have kissed him. I knew it, he knew it, and the knowledge left me trembling. My aunt cleared her throat gently. "Perhaps we should all go inside. It's far too cold for lingering conversations." Adrian nodded, but his gaze found mine again, soft, searching, filled with an ache that tightened my chest. "We will finish this conversation," he said quietly. "I promise you that." I looked away, unable to bear the fullness of his expression, because in that moment, the truth was undeniable. I was not afraid of his nearness. I was afraid of how desperately I had wanted it. The walk back to my aunt's cottage felt longer than it truly was, each step thickened by unsaid words, and the heavy flutter of my heartbeat, still tangled with the echo of what had nearly happened beneath the orchard's winter branches. Adrian walked beside me in silence, close enough that I felt the warmth he carried, yet far enough that propriety slid like a thin sheet of ice between us. My aunt kept a polite distance ahead, clearly torn between protecting me and pretending she had not just thwarted the most intimate moment of my life. When we reached the door, she ushered us inside with flustered efficiency, bringing tea and blankets, insisting we warm ourselves before continuing any important conversations. But the moment the door closed behind her retreating figure, leaving Adrian and me alone near the hearth, the air grew thick again, charged, tremulous, aching with everything we hadn't finished saying. I sat down slowly, fingers twisting in my lap, trying to gather scattered pieces of thought into something coherent. Adrian remained standing for a moment longer, staring into the fire as though searching for steadiness in its glow. Finally, he spoke, voice low. "I should not have let myself come so close to you in the orchard." The words pierced me, not in rejection, but in truth. He ran a hand through his hair, snowmelt glistening in the dark strands. "Not because I regret it," he continued, turning toward me, "but because I fear I acted out of impulse when you needed clarity, not confusion." My breath eased, though my heart still felt too fragile. "I do not blame you for what nearly happened," I whispered. "I blame myself as much as anyone." He shook his head with quiet intensity. "You blame yourself too often." Silence pooled between us, warm and heavy. I stared at my hands, words clinging to the back of my throat. "Adrian," I finally whispered, "the truth is, I do not know what to do. I do not know how to feel." His posture softened, his gaze gentling. "Then tell me what frightens you most." What frightened me? Everything. The memory of the forged letter, the look of doubt in his eyes, the suffocating cruelty of the ton, but also the tenderness he had shown me, the confession he had spoken, the nearness I had almost surrendered to. "I am afraid," I said slowly, "that if I trust you, I will lose myself again. I spent so long being invisible. I do not know how to be seen without breaking." Adrian's expression shifted into something raw and earnest. "Then let me help you learn," he murmured. "Not by standing before you or above you, but beside you." My throat tightened. "You ask a great deal." "I know. And what if I am not strong enough?" His eyes softened with a kind of reverence that made warmth flutter deep within me. "Emilia," he said quietly, "you have endured more cruelty in these last weeks than some endure in a lifetime. You have stood under the weight of lies and refused to bow. Do you truly not see your strength?" A tear slipped down my cheek, surprising me. Adrian stepped forward, slowly enough that I could stop him if I wished. I didn't. He brushed the tear away with a touch so gentle it broke something open inside me. "You do not have to choose right now," he said. "Not between forgiveness or distance, not between your heart or your fear, but you must choose for yourself, for perhaps the first time in your life, what future you want." I drew a trembling breath. "And what if the future I want feels impossible?" He gave a small, aching smile. "Then we will make it possible." My aunt reappeared then, carrying more tea, giving us a moment to compose ourselves before rejoining us by the fire. But the conversation had shifted something inside me, quietly, irrevocably. I was no longer the girl running from London's cruelty. I was a woman standing at a crossroads, staring down two paths, one shaped by fear and one by a courage I was still learning to claim. And for the first time, the choice felt like mine. That night, long after my aunt had retired and the cottage had grown hushed beneath the soft weight of falling snow, I lay awake in the small guest chamber, staring at the shadows trembling across the ceiling. Sleep would not come. My thoughts churned in relentless circles: Adrian's confession, the way his hand had brushed my tear, the promise in his voice when he told me he would stand beside me rather than before me. A promise I wanted to believe, a promise I feared believing. I turned onto my side, pulling the blankets closer around me, but the warmth did little to ease the cold ache inside my chest. I had fled London because I believed Adrian had doubted me, because that single hesitation had cracked open every insecurity I'd ever carried. Yet now he was here, truly here, having crossed miles through winter storms to find me, to speak the truth, to ask for the chance to earn my forgiveness. I pressed a trembling hand to my heart, unsettled by the fierce longing that rose within me, but longing alone could not erase what had happened. Trust was not something that returned with a single apology. It was rebuilt slowly, gently, with care. I needed clarity, time to think, time to breathe. At dawn, pale gold light seeped through the curtains, casting a soft halo across the cottage floorboards. I rose quietly, dressed, and slipped outside before the household woke. Frost sparkled across the ground like scattered diamonds. The orchard stood silent, branches drooping with fresh snow. The world hushed as though holding its breath again, this time waiting for my decision. I walked the familiar path back to the place where Adrian had found me the day before. My footprints from that moment had faded, softened by new snowfall, but the memory lingered sharply in my chest. I wrapped my arms around myself and inhaled the crisp air. It tasted like winter, like renewal, like choices I had never before been allowed to make. I did not notice Adrian until I turned and found him standing at the edge of the clearing, his posture still and reverent, as though he feared stepping closer might shatter the fragile quiet surrounding me. His breath formed pale clouds in the cold morning air, and snow dusted his dark coat and the curls at his temples. He looked tired, tired in a way that spoke of sleepless hours and heavy thoughts, but when his eyes met mine, they warmed with a gentleness that made my throat tighten. "I wasn't sure if you wanted to see me this morning," he said softly, his voice tentative in a way I had never heard from him before. "I wasn't sure either," I whispered, surprising myself with the honesty. He took a slow step forward. "Tell me what you're thinking." I looked away, watching a single snowflake drift lazily through the air before dissolving against my glove. "I'm thinking," I said, "that part of me wants to trust you, truly. And another part is afraid that if I open myself to you again, I will be hurt worse than before." Adrian inhaled slowly, pain flickering in his expression. "I understand," he murmured, "but Emilia, I swear to you, every hesitation I ever held was born from my past, not from anything you have ever done. You deserve someone who sees you without shadows. I am trying, God knows I am trying, to become that man." His voice trembled, and the vulnerability in it cracked something inside me. I looked at him fully then, seeing not the Duke, not the man society praised or feared, but the man who had crossed miles to find me, who had stood in my aunt's cottage with his pride stripped away, who was offering me not perfection but sincerity. I stepped forward, closing a fraction of the distance between us. "I don't know where this leads," I whispered. "I don't know if I am ready." Adrian's breath hitched, but his reply was soft and steady. "Then we walk slowly, together, at your pace, not mine." The orchard fell silent again, hushed, sacred, waiting, and for the first time since the gala, my heart did not feel broken. It felt hopeful, trembling, yes, but hopeful. The next days unfolded with a gentleness I had not expected, as though the world itself sensed how close I stood to breaking and chose, for once, not to push me further. Adrian remained at my aunt's estate, though not under the same roof. My aunt insisted on propriety with stiff but good, natured resolve, securing him rooms in the small hunting lodge nearby. Yet despite the distance, he was present in quiet, careful ways that neither startled nor pressured me. A carriage ride to the market where he kept a proper distance but walked beside me. A small bouquet of winter jasmine left on the cottage step at dawn, with no note but the faintest imprint of his glove in the snow. A question asked only once each day, "Are you well?" never followed by anything that demanded more of me than I could give. But even gentle certainty could not silence the storm inside me. I was learning the shape of something I had never known before, a slow, careful tenderness that did not demand perfection, that did not require me to shrink or apologize or make myself small. And it frightened me as much as it warmed me. One evening, after supper, I stepped outside to clear my thoughts. The sky was awash in faded lavender, the first stars piercing through the dusk. My breath rose in delicate plumes, disappearing into the cold air. I wrapped my arms around myself and began walking the path toward the orchard, drawn by an inexplicable ache, some part of me seeking answers where everything had begun to unravel and then rebuild. I did not expect Adrian to be waiting there. He stood beneath one of the old apple trees, hands clasped behind his back, his posture rigid as though he were wrestling with a battle inside his own mind. When he saw me, something softened in his gaze, but he did not step forward. He remained still, offering me the choice to approach or not. My feet carried me toward him before my thoughts could intervene. "Emilia," he said quietly, dipping his head in greeting. "I did not intend to intrude. Your aunt mentioned you sometimes walk here in the evenings, and I hoped I might see you." "That isn't an intrusion," I murmured, though my voice trembled. "Not from you." A breath escaped him, relief, fragile and unguarded. "I have been thinking," he said, looking up at the darkening sky, "about what it means to ask someone to trust you. Trust is not won by grand gestures or declarations. It is earned in the small things, consistent things." His voice lowered. "And I wish to earn yours." The honesty in his words struck something deep inside me. For so long, I had believed myself unremarkable, a quiet girl forgotten by society, overshadowed by her sister. Yet here stood a man whom London revered, a duke shaped by restraint, fear, pride, willing to learn gentleness for my sake. "Adrian," I said softly, "you must understand something too. I am still afraid." He nodded, the faintest pain crossing his expression. "I know, but—" I swallowed hard. "Every day since you came here, the fear has grown smaller, not gone, just smaller." He took one slow, careful step forward. "And what has grown in its place?" I hesitated, breath-catching as the truth rose like a fragile bloom inside me. "Something I do not yet have the courage to name." His eyes warmed with a tenderness that unraveled me. "Then allow me to name mine," he whispered. He did not touch me, but his voice caressed every fragile fracture inside me. "I am falling in love with you, Emilia. Slowly, irrevocably, unwillingly, and without remedy." The orchard spun, my breath stilled. The words, so simple, so devastating, sank into me like warmth after a long winter. I pressed a hand to my heart, feeling it strain beneath my ribs as though trying to break free. And though I could not yet say the words back, not when my fear still lingered, not when my heart still trembled, I stepped closer, close enough that the cold air between us thinned into something far more fragile. "Then keep falling," I whispered, "and I will try not to run." Winter loosened its grip slowly, reluctantly, as though reluctant to surrender the quiet cocoon in which I had rebuilt the fragile parts of myself. Each passing day at my aunt's estate softened the bite of cold wind, coaxed the first hints of green from beneath the snow, and brought a cautious warmth, not just to the world, but to the uneasy, tender place between Adrian and me. He remained nearby, never overstepping, never demanding more than I could give, always offering steadiness in small, thoughtful gestures that gathered into something meaningful. He walked with me through the thawing orchard, always leaving half a step of space between us. He read aloud from books he brought from the lodge, poetry on some days, essays on others, his voice quiet, rich, grounding. He lingered in the cottage only when invited, always careful, always listening. And slowly, steadily, the fear I once carried like armor began to loosen. But London did not forget us, nor forgive us. Not yet. A letter arrived one afternoon, sealed with my father's familiar mark. My hands trembled as I opened it at the kitchen table, while my aunt kneaded bread with firm, reassuring motions. "Emilia, the situation in London has grown complicated. The Harritons circulate new rumors. Society whispers that you fled because of guilt, not injury. Your mother remains distressed, though she will not say so aloud. Clarissa will not leave her room. I ask that you return home when you are able. Not for scandal's sake, London will say what it pleases, but for the sake of our family. Your absence has created a void none of us can ignore. Come when you are ready. We will face whatever comes together. Your father." I read it twice, the parchment softening under my tightening grip. My aunt wiped her hands and rested them on my shoulders, her touch grounding me. "You don't have to decide today," she said gently. "Or tomorrow. Or ever. if you choose not to. But I already felt the decision forming like heat in my chest. I had run from London not because I lacked bravery, but because I lacked certainty. Now, though that certainty was still tender, still forming its shape within me, it existed. When I stepped outside to clear my thoughts, I found Adrian at the edge of the orchard, his coat unbuttoned, hair tousled by the mild spring breeze. He inhaled sharply when he saw my expression. "A letter?" he asked. I handed it to him. As he read, a muscle in his jaw tightened. "Do you wish to go back?" he asked quietly, returning the letter. "Or do you fear being dragged into their cruelty again?" "I don't fear them anymore," I said softly, and surprising myself with the truth of it. Or rather, not enough to run again. His gaze softened, warm as early spring sunlight. "And what do you fear then?" My breath trembled, leaving something unfinished between us. The orchard fell utterly silent. Not even the birds dared interrupt what hung between us like a delicate thread. Adrian stepped forward, slow and careful, as though approaching something sacred. "Emilia," he murmured, "whatever future you choose, I will not vanish from it. I will not allow your courage to stand alone." The warmth blooming in my chest nearly overwhelmed me. "Then walk with me," I whispered. "Back to what I fled, back to what frightened me, back to what might yet become something beautiful." He dipped his head, reverence etched into every line of his face. "Always," he said. When we returned to the cottage, hand brushing hand, my aunt looked at us with an understanding smile, as though she had known this moment would come long before either of us dared believe it. And that night, as I packed my trunk once more, I realized that I was not the girl who had fled London in tears. I was someone stronger, someone who had learned, in the quiet refuge of winter, how to step toward the things that frightened her, instead of away. The journey back to London felt nothing like the desperate flight that had carried me away from it. Then, I had been hollow, raw, running from a city whose whispers cut deeper than knives. Now, as the carriage rattled along the familiar road, I felt something steadier blooming within me, a fragile but determined resolve that held its shape even as the spires of the city emerged through the thinning winter mist. Adrian rode alongside the carriage on horseback, his posture composed yet alert, as though ready to intercept any threat that dared approach. Every so often, our eyes met through the window, brief glances that sent warmth unfurling beneath my ribs, quiet assurances that I was not returning alone, not returning unseen. When we crossed into the heart of London, the tension in the air shifted. People paused as the carriage rolled past, curiosity sparking across their faces like flint striking stone. I felt my breath tighten, but I did not shrink back. Not this time. The girl who had once recoiled beneath stares was gone. What remained was a woman who had learned, painfully and slowly, how to stand. My family home loomed ahead, its pale stone facade immaculate, its windows bright with afternoon light. When the carriage halted, my heart beat a frantic drum against my ribs, but I stepped down with steady resolve, aided not by Adrian's hand but by my own will. The front door swung open before I reached it. My mother stood in the entryway, her expression a mix of relief, guilt, and something I had never quite seen from her before, fear that she had lost me. "Emilia," she breathed, pressing a trembling hand to her throat. You're home." My father appeared beside her, weary but earnest. "We've missed you," he said, voice softening. "More than you know." I swallowed the sudden ache in my throat and stepped inside. The warmth of the hall enveloped me, familiar and bittersweet. But before I could speak, a door creaked open at the end of the corridor. Clarissa stood in the threshold of her room. Her hair was undone, her complexion pale, eyes shadowed with something far heavier than anger. She had lost weight, she had lost sleep, and when her gaze met mine, every unspoken rift between us seemed to surge upward like a wave about to break. She moved first, slow, hesitant, as though each step cost her something. "Emilia," she whispered, her voice roughened by days of silence. "You came back." I nodded. Words failed me. She stared at me as though searching for the sister she had once known, perhaps unsure if she had destroyed that bond entirely. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly, so sharply, so unexpectedly, that my breath caught. Tears gathered in her eyes, making them shimmer like fractured glass. "I'm so sorry for everything. For the letter, for the lies, for all of it. I didn't think it would go so far. I didn't think—" Her voice broke. My parents looked stunned, as though witnessing a confession they had never imagined hearing. I felt every wound she had dealt me, every whisper, every humiliation, every cruelty, press against my ribs like a bruise. But beneath it all was something far older. Years of watching her be the center of every room while I lived quietly on the edges. Years of being her shadow instead of her sister. And now she stood before me, stripped of pride, trembling under the weight of her own choices. "Clarissa," I whispered, my voice thick, "I cannot forget what you did. Not yet." Her face crumpled, but I lifted a hand, gently, carefully, before she could turn away. "But I am here," I continued, "and that means something." Behind me, I sensed Adrian step into the doorway, his presence steady and bright like a lantern cutting through fog. Clarissa's gaze flickered toward him, then back to me, guilt and understanding warring silently. "Does he know?" she whispered. "Everything?" "Yes," I said. "And he came anyway." Clarissa drew a trembling breath, nodding slowly, as though accepting a truth she had fought too long to deny. My family hovered near, uncertain but hopeful. And for the first time since the storm began, I felt the weight of the past shifting, not erased, not healed, but moving, making space, making room. I did not know what tomorrow would bring, but as I stood surrounded by the people who had shaped my life, for better and for worse, I felt the ground beneath my feet steady again. For the first time, I was not returning as the quiet, unnoticed sister. I was returning as myself, and I was not alone. The Hale drawing room had never felt so strangely quiet. Afternoon light streamed through the tall windows, turning the dust motes into drifting flecks of gold, settling across the polished furniture my mother guarded so fiercely. Yet no one cared for the furniture now. Not when Adrian Ravenscar stood before my family, straight, backed and resolute, his gloved hands clasped behind him, his gaze steady despite the tension that rippled through the room like a held breath. I stood at his side, still unsure if my presence strengthened me or frightened me more, but the warmth of him beside me steadied every trembling part of my heart. My mother perched rigidly on the settee, my father stood at the mantel with his arms folded, and Clarissa lingered in the doorway as though uncertain she deserved to witness what was about to unfold. Adrian cleared his throat, his voice low and firm. "Lord and Lady Hale," he began, "I have come to speak honestly about my intentions regarding your daughter." My mother's fingers tightened around her handkerchief. My father's expression betrayed nothing, but his eyes, sharp, assessing, revealed how seriously he weighed the Duke's every word. Adrian drew a breath that trembled only faintly. "I have wronged Emilia," he continued, "by hesitating when she needed certainty, by allowing my past to cloud my judgment, by failing to protect her from cruelty that was, in part, caused by my actions. I cannot change what happened, but I can vow that such harm will never befall her again." My heart clenched painfully. I had not known he planned to say such things aloud, in front of my parents, in front of Clarissa. He turned then, not to them, but to me, and the world seemed to narrow to the space between us. "Emilia," he said softly, yet loud enough that the room seemed to pulse with the sound of it, "I came to the countryside to ask your forgiveness, but today I come to ask something more." He stepped closer, not touching me, but near enough that warmth spread through my chest in a soft, dazzling wave. "You once told me you didn't know how to be seen without breaking. I promise you this, you will never stand alone again, not against the ton, not against rumor, not against fear." My breath shook. Adrian's voice gentled even further. "I care for you, deeply, steadily, and I would like the chance, if you will grant it, to court you properly, with full transparency, full respect, and full knowledge of everything we have endured to reach this moment." The room fell utterly silent. My mother pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. My father's stern composure cracked into something softer, almost relieved. Clarissa lowered her gaze, tears slipping silently down her cheeks, not from jealousy now, but something closer to remorse. But all I saw was Adrian, his hope, his vulnerability, his willingness to stand before everyone and choose me, not in secret, not in shadows, not in hesitation, but in truth. I stepped forward, my pulse wild and unsteady. "Adrian," I whispered, "I cannot pretend I am without fear. I cannot pretend that trust will return all at once." His expression softened with understanding. "It does not have to," he murmured. I took another step, close enough that the faint scent of winter and horse and pine clung to him, familiar now, comforting. My hand lifted, hesitant, trembling, and rested over his. "But I want to try," I whispered. "I want the chance to see what we can become, not as rumors or shadows, but as ourselves." "E6, Relief swept across his face, raw, brilliant, unrestrained. He took my hand gently, reverently, as though it were something precious. "Then I am yours," he breathed. "At your pace, at your choosing." My family exhaled together, a hush softening the air as though something fractured within us had finally begun to mend. Clarissa wiped her cheeks, offering me a small, broken nod, one I returned with cautious hope. When Adrian lifted my hand and pressed a quiet kiss to my knuckles, the warmth that bloomed through me felt like spring breaking through the last frost. It felt like beginning, and though the world beyond our door still waited with its whispers and judgments, I no longer feared it. Because for the first time, I walked into that world not hidden, not shrinking, not unnoticed, but chosen, and finally, undeniably, seen.